There are few things that I love more than a strong, badass female lead in the stories I consume. Whether it's anime or movies, there's just something about watching a deadly yet ravishingly beautiful woman slay her enemies with style and grace. That just feels right to me. I know I cannot be the only one who feels that way. So when I sit down and think of some characters who fit this bill, the name Red Sonja almost immediately pops up in my head. Created all the way back in 1973 by Roy Thomas, who adapted her from a character from one of Robert E. Howard's stories, Red Sonja has been slaying the hearts of fans and foes for nearly 5 decades now. Over the years, she has featured in numerous comic books and films, with each one putting their own spin on her saga. So join me today as I take you through the mythical Hyborean age that existed after the sinking of Atlantis and before the time of the Sons of Aryas, to explore the various origins of this red-headed female warrior, Red Sonja. Let's begin. How was Red Sonja first inspired before comics? For the longest time, I had always loved the character of Red Sonja, being a big sucker for Robert E. Howard's Hyborean age and the stories set in it, particularly that of Conan the Barbarian. However, over the course of doing my research for this video, there were several key factors that emerged particularly about her origins, which came as a surprise to me. I had always assumed that Red Sonja had existed within the Hyborean age continuity, but apparently that was not the case at the start. In fact, the character of Red Sonja as we know her isn't even created by Robert E. Howard, although she appears within this fictional timeline that he created, and sometimes alongside his most iconic character, Conan. The Red Sonja that we know is actually inspired from a character by Robert E. Howard called Red Sonja of Rigatoni, who appears in a period piece short story called The Shadow of the Vulture. In this story, the red-headed female warrior gets caught up in a conflict between the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman and a Germanic knight called Gottfried von Kamblach, who has earned the Sultan's wrath for seriously wounding him in a prior battle. I won't be going too deep into the plot of the short story, as it doesn't really serve the intention of the video, but Red Sonja plays an integral role in this conflict. I thought it was pretty cool for Howard to include such a strong female character into a medieval setting like this, where she is actually a total badass, since this wasn't really always the case for women in that time period. Red Sonja saves the day on numerous occasions, rescuing von Kamblach from the clutches of the Sultan and his agents. In my eyes, she embodies the swashbuckling adventurer to a T. I love how Howard made her so unabashedly fierce, bold, and brilliant. It is no wonder that the writer Roy Thomas and artist Barry Windsor Smith were inspired by her to give us the Red Sonja that you and I are both familiar with. Roy Thomas would take much of the characteristics of the original Red Sonja of Rigatoni, including her red hair, and swap the historical setting for Howard's Hyborean age. Oh, and he would give her a chainmail bikini. Almost missed out on that fact. I think that it's interesting how Thomas and Smith took Robert E. Howard's original character, gave her a fresh coat of paint, and placed her back in a completely new setting by the same author. How was Red Sonja first introduced in comics? By the time Red Sonja first made her appearance in comic books, Marvel had already acquired the license for the franchise in 1970. It would take until the 23rd issue of Conan the Barbarian in 1973 for us to see the red-headed warrior in action. The story takes place with Conan on the run from a squad of Turanian soldiers, whose leader is a legendary warrior called Mikhail Oglu. I'd like to pause just for a second to highlight why I love the Conan series so much by focusing on this tiny detail. You see, while Conan is overwhelmingly skilled and strong compared to most foes out there, I love how they don't portray him as this invincible warrior. If you read this particular comic, you will see how Conan's very first instinct is to run from his pursuers, knowing very well that he is vastly outnumbered. It is this practicality that adds such an immense amount of realism to this fictional world, in my opinion. Moving back to the story, just as the Turanians corner the barbarian and are about to slay him, a band of warriors emerge from a fortification behind him, led by a red-headed female. This is the exact instance in which Red Sonja makes her comic book debut. I think you must have noticed some parallels here between the circumstances of her first appearance in this comic book and the short story where the character she was inspired by appeared. The folks behind the comics directly adapted several of that story's elements into this comic, which is why you also have characters like Mikhail Oglu, who is there in the original story as well. However, in place of Gottfried von Kambach, we get Conan the Cimmerian. She next appears later in the same issue when, just like in Howard's story, Conan is captured by traitors to be handed to the people who want him dead. Once again, Red Sonja appears and rescues Conan, leaving him indebted to her. While it would take some time before we actually got a more fleshed out origin story, I think it was pretty smart of them to adapt the short story and use it to introduce her character. I believe that it made the transition smoother for both fans and Red Sonja into this new world from her old. Honestly, I think if you love Robert E. Howard's works, then the short story that I constantly refer to called The Shadow of the Vulture is definitely something you should check out. When was Red Sonja's classic Marvel origin first told? Despite making her first appearance in 1973, we wouldn't get this fiery redhead's origin story until 1978 in Kull and the Barbarians, issue number 3. I think while Red Sonja's tragic origins are not something uncommon, the writers do just enough to make them unique and intriguing. You will know what I'm talking about in a second. So, Red Sonja was not always this ravishing and fearsome warrior who was almost unmatched in combat. Thousands of men had made the mistake of underestimating her, and all of them had died with regret and in shock. Allow me to tell you a story about the original birth of this legend. Long ago, in rural Hyborean, there lived a retired mercenary with his wife, 2 sons, and a daughter. He had long given up the sword in exchange for a plow, choosing to live a normal life as a farmer far from the fires of war. However, this choice had not been made for him willingly, as he had been crippled in a campaign years ago. This nameless Hyborean spent his days training his sons in the art of war, while his daughter helped her mother with running the household. However, deep within the heart of his daughter smoldered a flame, which was ignited perhaps by her jealousy towards her brothers or the admiration for her father, to learn the way of the sword as well. So she would sneak out and try and train with her father's sword whenever she got a chance. Unfortunately for her, the weapon would prove to be too heavy, and yet she would try every night, mimicking the movements her father had taught her brothers during the day. I love these small attention to details, where despite her desire, the girl is not able to pick up the sword, which is clearly too heavy. I believe these things add a touch of realism, which sometimes gets overlooked in fantastical tales such as this. Despite the struggles, the family would lead a life of peace, but this would all come crumbling down one day when a group of Hyborean mercenaries would arrive at their doorsteps. The father, sensing the danger, would make his family hide in their house and confront the man who had once been his second in command. The arrogant leader of the mercenaries, who had now taken his place as the commander, would swiftly order the farmer's execution, accusing him of cowardice. Enraged by their father's death, the sons would emerge to avenge him, but would be swiftly cut down in cold blood, followed by their mother. The girl, who had remained hidden all this time, would finally lunge at the men with her father's sword. However, she was not yet the warrior she was destined to be. They would overpower and sexually assault her before torching her house, with her still inside it. Yet, the fates would come to her rescue, this red-headed girl, and despite having her innocence robbed, she would survive the ordeal. In this moment of utter desperation, she would be visited by a vision of the goddess Scathach, who offers her the strength to crush her enemies in exchange for a vow. The vow being that she would never love another man until he had bested her in fair combat. The vengeful young girl would take the goddess's offer and rise up as Red Sonja. I love this origin story, but there is a tiny little thing that leaves a somewhat sour taste in my mouth about it. The fact that Sonja's battle prowess is not earned through hard work, but through divine blessings, kind of waters down her aura in my eyes. Regardless, I'm not going to complain much about it, as it is still a fairly decent origin tale that goes well with her character. What do you think about it? Let me know in the comments. How did Gail Simone completely reboot Red Sonja's origin? Starting with Gail Simone's run at Dynamite Comics in 2014, I can tell you there is a massive reimagining of Red Sonja's origin story compared to that of the original. If you recall from what I have said earlier regarding her origins, Sonja had her entire family murdered before her eyes, before being raped by her attackers. There is also the fact that her powers are the result of a divine blessings of a goddess that came with a vow. Well, Gail Simone looked at all these things and seems to have decided to do away with almost all of it. In Red Sonja, Volume 2, issue number 1-6, Gail Simone presents what I think is a much more grounded and realistic take on this red-headed tornado's background. In this story, we first meet Sonja within the dungeons of the castle of a fallen kingdom, when she is discovered by the victors of a battle that had just ended. The victors had expected the prisoners they found to be men, since these prisoners were supposed to be gladiators, but to their shock, the inmates turn out to be two women, who they surmised were the final survivors of a gladiatorial tournament. The previous king had been known to throw extravagant gladiatorial death games to appease his masses, and these two women, one of whom was Red Sonja, had survived till the very end against all odds. According to the one who discovers them, Sonja and her companion had been treated and kept like dogs in the dungeon, which is proven by the condition in which they are found, strung up by their arms bound in thick chains from the ceiling. However, instead of killing or enslaving the two, Damaeth the king orders them to be cleaned and fed before setting them free. That's at least how her tale begins in this new continuity, but let me take you further back to explore her past in a deeper sense. As a child, Red Sonja, whose real name is revealed to be Sonjita, was part of a family of 5 that consisted of her father, mother, and 2 brothers. But this is where the similarity between the older stories and this ends. Unlike in the 1973 story, Sonja's father is a hunter instead of a mercenary, and he has taught the bow and the ways of the wild to all of his children. While not as skilled as her brothers, Sonja is shown to be far swifter than them. Unfortunately, while out on a hunt, they notice a fire coming from the direction of their village, which turns out to be a full-blown marauder raid. In the conflict that ensues, her family is killed mercilessly, as Sonja is made to watch by one of the villains responsible. Just as I was dreading another sexual assault scene, Sonja proves me wrong by killing the man. She then buries all the victims, including her parents and siblings, and begins preparing to kill the men responsible. I have to remind you that she is just 12 during this time. I think that it's beyond cool that, unlike her older version, she is already a hardened fighter here, and there is a believable explanation for it. What follows is total carnage, as Sonja begins to murder hardened killers one by one, starting with their leader who had orphaned her and left her without family. Following this, she wanders from place to place until she is captured and placed in the Zamoran fighting pits, where Damaeth finds her. I truly love the fact that in this version of the story, they correct the gripe I had with the previous one, where her abilities didn't feel earned. Here, everything about her martial prowess is totally earned through hardship and actual combat experience. There is no divine intervention or magical weapons involved, and that makes Gail Simone's Red Sonja an absolute badass, in my opinion. How was Red Sonja introduced in the live-action Conan series? My first introduction to the character of Red Sonja actually came from the 1985 film, which had actors like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Brigitte Nielsen in the film. It was only later, after I read the comics, that I realized that the film takes certain creative liberties with her origins. The biggest change has to be the fact that the antagonist responsible for the death of Sonja's family is not a marauder or a mercenary gang. The 1985 film poses the evil tyrannical Empress Gedren as the cause for Red Sonja's trauma. In my opinion, this is the weakest origin story out of all the ones that we have discussed so far. The film starts with Gedren trying to seduce Sonja, having become enamored by her beauty. Unfortunately for the Empress, Sonja is disgusted by her lustful approach and ends up scarring the monarch's face. Burning with hatred after being spurned and disfigured, Gedren orders her soldiers to murder Sonja's family. She then makes her soldiers assault her sexually before setting her house on fire. I immediately noticed that the origin story is actually fairly similar to the original one. However, by the looks of her father, he looked neither like a former mercenary or a hunter, which leads me to believe that in this story, Sonja's family most likely were actually ordinary peasants. She didn't have a warrior lineage at all, unlike in the previous 2 continuities. Once again, the distraught girl is approached by a female spirit who offers her the power to fight the wrongs done to her. I noticed another couple of key differences here, which is worth mentioning. First of all, throughout the film, they never once call this entity the Celtic goddess Scathach. But more importantly, I think they do not mention the vow, where she cannot bed a man unless she is defeated by that person in honest combat. In my opinion, this origin of Sonja feels extremely rushed, especially because the entire scene plays out in about the first 2 minutes of the film. We get absolutely no background about her father or her family. This magical entity also is not given any sort of recognition, which left me confused about why she would empower Sonja. There is also the fact that this version of Red Sonja's powers feels even less earned than the classic comics version, because at least in the 1973 origin story, she was seen practicing with her father's sword and had a desire to become a warrior, following in her dad's footsteps. Here she is literally a damsel in distress who gets blessed by an entity to become this badass heroine with little to no explanation. Don't get me wrong, the film is still a cult classic, and I enjoyed watching it for what it was. This is just my opinion about the film's take on Sonja's origin story. You might have a different opinion. How did the 2025 film build a hybrid new origin? When the 2025 Red Sonja film came out, I was excited beyond words, like most fans of the series. Unfortunately, I think we should have had our expectations somewhat tempered, as the film didn't really live up to the hype. But that's not going to stop me from discussing the origins of Sonja in it. Right off the bat, the origin story is immediately subverted from what we are usually accustomed to for Red Sonja. In all the origins I have discussed so far, you will notice that the initial incident is deeply personal to her. We watch as she is sexually assaulted in some cases, and in every single instance, her family is butchered right in front of her eyes. These scenes give the audience a sense of her innocence being lost and grant her a proper personal motivation to become the warrior she eventually becomes. There is a drive that is fueled by her vendetta, much like Batman if you think about it, which pushes her on even after she has avenged her family. The 2025 film completely removes the personal elements and lays it out as a generic revenge story that fails to establish any sort of concrete motivation for her becoming Red Sonja. You see, in this film, Hyrcania is being invaded by barbarians who are raping and pillaging through her tribe and their land. During this assault, a young Sonja witnesses the brutality being inflicted on her people, but somehow ends up being separated from them. There is no mention of her immediate family like in the older origins. Years pass by, and through the hardship of seeing faces in the wilderness, we are shown that Sonja has already blossomed into a deadly warrior. There is no divine intervention here to grant her powers, at least not in the way we are used to seeing. This Red, as you can see, just appears as a badass, and we are asked to believe that hunting and foraging have made her deadly enough to take on groups of trained soldiers. Anyways, later on we do get a goddess called Ashera, who is a forest deity worshipped by the Hyrcanians, who comes to aid Red Sonja in her hour of need. However, I must remind you she has nothing to do with granting her any abilities related to her martial prowess, like Scathach does. I think while the previous origins alter certain elements of her early days, this film completely removes it as a canon event. On the more positive side, we are still getting Red Sonja films in this day and age. That has to be a win, even if this origin story wasn't one. Personally, I think Red Sonja, if done right, has everything that a sword and sorcery series needs to succeed. It's got a badass female lead, a deep lore-driven world, interesting side characters and villains, and an already existing rabid fanbase. I think it's natural for a character as old as Red Sonja to get multiple versions of her origins, as different writers have a go at her character. Honestly, I don't think any of the origins we have mentioned today are actually criminally bad, even the 2025 film version. She's one of those characters who has evolved past being mere fan service to actually being a legitimately loved and admired character by millions of fans worldwide. So tell me, which is your favorite origin story for Red Sonja in the comments below? For now though, it's time for me to say goodbye. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to drop a like and subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel grow and lets me bring you more videos like this.